All the owners under a joint tenancy own the property together in its entirety. The deed does not specify ownership percentage because one of the requirements of joint tenancy is that all ownership shares are equal, must be equal. 2 owners, 50-50. 3 owners, 33.33% each. The most important characteristic of joint tenancy is the right of survivorship. Utah law assumes each joint tenant owns a right of survivorship. Other states require the rights of survivorship to be specifically stated in the deed. The right of survivorship automatically transfers the property to the remaining owners upon one owner's death. The remaining owners will own the property in its entirety, regardless of the dead person's will. Co-owners, also called tenants, A, B, and C, own a property. Because it is joint tenancy, each tenant owner owns an equal share. Tenant C dies. Upon death, Tenant C's shares automatically transfer to A and B. The only thing necessary to prove the transfer is a recording of the death certificate for Tenant C in the county in which the property is located. Later, Tenant B dies. Another transfer of title takes place immediately upon the death of Tenant B. His share goes to Tenant A, who is now an owner in severalty. Once again, all is necessary to prove the transfer, because it was owned in joint tenancy, is the recording of the death certificate of Tenant B in the county in which the property is located. And as previously stated, Tenant A is now an owner in severalty. Tenant A then dies and wills interest to Tenant B and D. This transfer occurs because of provisions in Tenant A's will. The new owners, Tenant D and E, receive their ownership interest because of the provisions in that will. Remember, Tenant A owned the property in severalty prior to his death. Establishing joint tenancy requires compliance with 4 requirements: unity of possession, unity of interest, unity of time, unity of title. The acronym PITT, P-I-T-T, can be used to remember the 4 requirements: possession, interest, time, and title. Unity of possession. This requirement means that all owners of all joint tenancies hold an undivided interest to possess the property. One joint tenant may not exclude the other joint tenant owners from occupying or possessing the property. Unity of interest. This requirement means all owners must hold equal ownership. This is why percentage ownership is never stated on the deed. The ownership is joint tenancy. All joint tenants own an equal share. Unity of time. This requirement mandates that all owners must become owners at the same time. If any owner takes ownership at a different time from the others, joint tenancy between all owners is impossible. Unity of title. This requirement holds that all owners must be granted their tenancy with the same conveyance document. If the conveyance does not occur on the same document, it would be impossible for all owners to gain ownership simultaneously, as required by the unity of time requirement. While ownership percentage is not specified under joint tenancy, the individual owners do have the right to transfer their share. If an individual owner transfers their share, the joint tenancy is severed. Let's illustrate when we review an example. In this example, tenants A, B, and C own a property as joint tenants. Tenant A sells his portion to Tenant D. Because Tenant D came into title at a different time and with a different document than the other owners, Tenant B and C, Tenant D's interest, even though it is equal to that of B and C, is held as a tenant in common. However, both tenants B and C still hold their ownership interest as joint tenants. In the event of Tenant D's death, Tenant D's 1/3 interest would be transferred according to the provisions of his will if he died testate. However, Tenant B and C, remember, are still joint tenants. In the event of Tenant B or Tenant C's death, because they hold their interest as joint tenants, their interest would be transferred to the remaining tenant. For example, tenant B's 1/3 interest would be transferred to tenant C, or tenant C's interest upon death would be transferred to tenant B because of the nature of joint tenancy. 4 brothers own a property as joint tenants. The eldest brother decides to sell his interest in the property to his sister. How much does the sister now own? Remember, one of the requirements of joint tenancy is that all owners possess an equal share. Older brother therefore owns a 1/4 interest, which is what he transfers to his sister. Now that the sister is an owner in the property, what is the ownership situation? The 3 remaining brothers on title of the property still own the property as joint tenants. The remaining 1/4 interest is owned by the sister. The sister is considered a tenant in common with the 3 brothers as joint tenants.